Thank you, and thank you, Justice Lafoy. I'm not going to use the PowerPoints because quite a bit is repeated in what Justin has said, and I just want to give you a flavour of one of the other principles of a human rights and equality approach to pensions and ageing would be to effectively proof policy. And what that would mean in practice is, I'm going to use examples of gender proofing particularly, but we're talking about proofing across the 9 grounds that's included in the equality legislation. So we're talking about things like disability, we're talking about things like ethnicity, travel or recognition. And what you're really talking about is the relationship between labour market inequality in your working age life and pension inequality in your older life, and understanding that if you experience labour inequality during your working age, you are more or less automatically likely to experience pension inequality in your older age. And that's what we want to try and separate out, is that we need to examine our present policy to make sure that people aren't experiencing that type of double disadvantage, that they pay for working life inequality with pension inequality. So we're looking not only then at the kind of grounds that are covered in relation to the equality legislation, but also socioeconomic inequality, a 10th ground. And particularly, and Micheál Collins started referring to that earlier on, people who are in precarious employment, people who are in low paid. A third of women, for example, are in part-time work, but 30% of Irish workers are actually formerly low paid, according to the OECD definition of low pay. So all of these workers, because of the nature of inequality they're experiencing in the labour market, are highly likely to have to carry that experience over into pension inequality, and that's really important. It's also important from the perspective of a poor labour market results in less money being paid into the social insurance system, and that has consequences for the capacity of the state to actually finance pensions, but it also has the capacity of those workers to have enough social insurance contributions over often an interrupted and a poor quality working life to actually have enough coverage for a social insurance pension. So it has those two types of things. And we'd suggest this is going to get a lot more serious as we look at the next couple of decades of how our labour market will restructure. Micheál mentioned this, that we see new forms of precarious work emerging, and indeed new forms of employment more generally. A lot of you will have read about them: the shadow economy, the gig economy, digital platforms like Uber and Kangaroo, bogus self-employment in the construction industry, much more sessional work in industries that didn't have it before. So all of these workers who traditionally probably would have got an ordinary job are now facing into new forms of employment that don't necessarily entitle them to social insurance coverage and that knock them out of future pension coverage. So we need to look at the new forms of work that are emerging, and we need to see about regulating them to pull them back in to social insurance coverage to make sure those workers don't experience future pension inequality. So, but just taking gender as an example, and as I've said, the less labour market participation you have, logically, the less likely you are to have an occupational pension, and the more likely you are to have to rely on the state pension. So the state pension is really important from the perspective of equality and human rights. And there are a number of things, that principles, if you like, that we can think about when we're looking to proof that state pension to ensure it's meeting human rights and equality principles. And Emily mentioned a lot of them, and I won't repeat them. Just to add to a couple, one would be independent access to income. The idea of dignity relates to the personal autonomy you have as a human being to live a life that you choose. So having direct access by law to your own pension is hugely important for women, and that's a key principle that you might want to proof for. The other one is in relation to the extent of emigration and migration that's happening in a more global world. So the portability of pensions, the capacity of people to bring their pensions with them. So for example, some of the rules we have at the moment, the habitual residence rule, for example, or the degree to which we require people to average out their pensions contributions over quite a long time period, makes it really difficult for returning migrants, or indeed Irish people who had emigrated and are returning home, to move easily back into our social welfare system. We have some blocks in the system that make it quite difficult for women, for example, who might have taken 2 decades, say, out of employment to care, it's difficult for them to get back into the social insurance system. And the rules we have that recognise the years they spend caring, they give them some recognition for the care they have and accommodate that in the social insurance system, but we could be much more generous with the amount of credit that we give to women for the time they spend caring to ensure that they would maximise their entitlement to the social insurance system. And indeed, as Justin said, we are not only improving the system from some perspectives and making it more equality-proofed. Some of the changes that happened, particularly changes in 2012 in the context of the austerity budgets, actually made it worse for those types of workers, and particularly for women. And again, those changes, maybe if they're equality-proofed, they might have been less likely to have happened, but they certainly, from the perspective of human rights and justice, they certainly need to be regressed and changed back to the situation that they were. So they're just some, I don't want to get too technical, but there are lots and lots of ways that we can proof our present system to make sure that we actually have it equality and human rights standard. The other area I just want to finish on very quickly is that issue of adequacy, which again is a human rights principle. And just to concur that idea of benchmarking it to the 35% of average industrial earnings was indeed a recommendation that was already made when there was a Partnership 2000 report in 2001 looking at the benchmarking and indexation of social welfare payments more generally. And you might be able to use, there's a lot of research in that report, and that's the very recommendation that it comes out with. But more generally, we would say that, equality is too important to be left to the market. And recognising the fundamental importance of the state pension and protecting it as the first really serious pillar of Irish pension policy is really important. And if there are issues about sustainability and financing of it, and particularly an adequate pension in it, I'd concur with what Justin said about looking to see how much we spend on financing market-based pensions, about 2.4 billion, and whether or not we have the right balance between that and what we might choose to invest in the state pension. So, for example, we could afford, to take 1/3 away from the tax expenditure that we have on private pensions and reinvest that in a stronger, more inclusive, more equality-proofed state pension. And I think that would go a long way to ensuring that we all could benefit from the state policy and pension. So I think that's the type of thing that we would again encourage, that not only should we equality-proof the state pension, but we should also take an equality lens to the distributional impact of the tax that we spend on supporting private pensions. 80% of the 2.4 million that we spend, for example, goes to the top 20% earners in Ireland. And within that, there's a very male bias towards the distribution of those tax credits as well. So I think once we start looking at the distributional outcomes, some policy choices become much more obvious to us about the alternative ways that there might be to spend money. Likewise, we talked earlier this morning about the idea of private pensions and mandatory enrolment, auto-enrolment, those types of things. Again, we would say don't do that without taking an equality lens to it, adequately proof it, and some other policy choices might be thrown up by the very exercise of making more transparent some of the distributional outcomes, some of the barriers that people might experience in auto-enrolment. So I won't go on much more than that, but just to say the principle of proofing policy, really being careful, being transparent and accountable about making sure that you have the full information and you know the consequences of what you're doing as a principle for policymakers is really important if we're taking a human rights and equality model to pensions. So thank you.